Well, the EFF is demanding that attorney Michael Hulley be ordered to pay back close to 32 million rand in taxpayers' money that has so far been spent on former President Jacob Zuma's legal fees. Yesterday, Zuma missed the deadline to challenge prosecutions boss Shaun Abrahams' decision not to accept his representations and to allow the criminal case against him to proceed. We've now got senior specialist reporter and journalist at Tiso Blackstar Karyn Maughan, who's been keeping a close eye on this story. She joins us from our Cape Town studios. Karyn, good evening to you, and thank you for talking to us as always. Firstly, you say questions over who's paying Zuma's legal bills may be the reason why he's missed the deadline. Can you explain?
Well, basically what's happened is that we know the Democratic Alliance launched that court action to stop the continued state legal funding of Jacob Zuma's legal fees. And the EFF has now brought a similar application in which they're challenging the state attorney's deal with former President Zuma to continue that funding, and also asking that in an application that's quite different to what the DA is doing, that Michael Hulley and the law firms that received the money for that legal funding be ordered to pay it back. Now, in light of that kind of situation, one can imagine that for the former president to procure lawyers to take on his case in a massive legal review of Shaun Abrahams' decision to continue with that prosecution will be quite difficult, because in terms of that kind of court application, any lawyer who knows they are taking on that case will also know that there's a very real possibility that they may be ordered to pay that money back.
So, in essence, then, we're facing a situation where the parties want not only for the state to not continue funding further action from the former president, but they want the monies that have already been spent on his legal fees to be paid back. I mean, if that situation plays itself out quite in that way, the former president will have his back against the wall.
Remember, of course, Bongani, that the North Gauteng High Court has already ordered former President Jacob Zuma to pay back the money spent on his failed bid to interdict the release of Thuli Madantsela's State of Capture report and his subsequent failed and disastrous attempt to review that same report. Now, we know that a personal cost order was sought against him by the opposition's case in the opposition parties in that matter. They were successful in making an argument to 3 judges that essentially the former president had used state funding as his own personal coffers to defend his personal interests, and the court ordering him to pay that personal cost order somewhere in the region of 10 million rand. Now, he has got private attorneys who are now attempting to appeal that order, but his back is already very much against the wall, and we know that in terms of the Nkandla pay back the money situation, he had to obtain a bond at VBS Bank in order to pay back that money. This is an individual who, as we know, was earning in the region of 2.9 million rand a year. The money involved here is exponentially more than that, and it certainly raises questions about, if he is ordered to pay back that money, where will he get that money from? Added to his difficulties, of course, Bongani, is it's apparent in the record that has already emerged from the presidency that President Thabo Mbeki at the time had made it quite clear that should the president fail in his applications or legal defense, he would actually have to pay back the money as well. We now, also in terms of these very unsuccessful applications that he made to stop to overturn the search and seizure warrants that were used so successfully to obtain 94,000 documents, and to try and challenge the mutual legal assistance request to Mauritius for certain documents. He failed in every single application that he brought in terms of trying to block or stop his prosecution or undermine the evidence against him. And according to the kind of things that we saw coming out of that correspondence, it was clear that the presidency at the time believed that he should be potentially liable for those costs.
I mean, it's a very interesting one, Karyn, because, of course, you're referring to that North Gauteng High Court decision in December. I mean, Justice Mlambo was quite scathing, in fact, of Zuma's so-called Stalingrad tactics to delay a number of issues and go through a lot of hoops for decisions to be made. But as you say, it all stems from that 2006 decision with Thabo Mbeki. But of course, Zuma has argued all along that all these matters stem out of his role in government, and therefore that is why the state should carry the cost for his legal fees. How much longer can he stick to this strategy?
Well, he's making reference to the State Attorneys Act, which was actually put in place, Bongani, for situations in which, for example, a police officer arrests a criminal and that criminal accuses him falsely, for instance, of assaulting him. That's the kind of scenario in which the state expected to fund the legal defense of, an individual or a state official. Now, we already have a precedent set in the Western Cape High Court very recently in the Arno Lamour case, where the judge in that matter said that officials accused of corruption could not ever be said to have been accused of crimes or so-called crimes committed in the scope of their duty. That is a legal precedent that stands. We also see Julius Malema arguing very powerfully that under the constitutional principle of equality before the law, it is simply untenable for one individual to have untrammeled and unfettered access to state money to defend themselves against charges that they should actually just go to court and face. The president's difficulty is that all of this litigation has not actually been in defense of himself against the actual charges that he's been facing. It's all been about defending himself against the potential evidence that already exists, trying to undermine that evidence, or trying to stop the DA's efforts that to undermine the decision not to prosecute him or to go ahead with that prosecution. And so, for him to argue now that, he is entitled to further funding to mount Stalingrad 2, which on the version of his lawyers might be a 10-year, decade-long campaign in order to avoid actually sitting in the dock like any ordinary South African would and answering to the charges against him, I think will be a very, very difficult pull for any court in this country to swallow.
So then let's wrap up this conversation. Karyn, can you paint the picture of the legal woes that the former President Jacob Zuma is going to be facing in the coming months?
Well, essentially, he's back in court in June to face that corruption case. The state has indicated that it is ready to proceed with it and can go ahead with that prosecution in November. We know that the state has handed over the docket containing the evidence against the former president. He faces a potential 25-year sentence for the racketeering, corruption, fraud charges against him. He is also battling to overturn that 10 million rand personal costs order against him in the state capture matter, and should he fail to get and he's also fighting this battle over his legal funding, which will be a crucial aspect to whether or not he is continued or able to sustain his Stalingrad campaign against prosecution. The really interesting legal and possibly political question that needs to be asked is, what is President Cyril Ramaphosa going to do in this situation? He has yet to indicate to file any kind of notice to oppose either the DA or the EFF application, and he may well decide to step out of the ring and allow a court to make an order that will effectively unyoke government from the burden of continuing to fund former President Zuma's ultimately, as yet up until now, futile attempts to avoid prosecution.
All right, that was a senior specialist reporter and journalist at Tiso Blackstar Karyn Maughan outlining the future in the immediate to long term for the former President Jacob Zuma.